Welcome to the Gateway Radio Program, a weekly radio series discussing the issues of human potential and technologies. The Gateway Radio Program is brought to you by the Monroe Institute, a research and educational organization dedicated to the exploration of conscious awareness. Here now is your host of the Gateway Radio Program, Mark Serta.
Welcome back to another edition of the Gateway Radio Program. I'm Mark Serta. Before we get things rolling here, I want to read you something that's very fascinating. It'll kind of set the tone for the interview. It begins like this. It was a miserable day with dark hanging clouds, and it had been raining on and off all throughout the afternoon. It was a Friday, and I had developed a bit of a habit of taking a few friends out to dinner in the early evening on most Fridays. It goes on to read that the conversation I don't remember as being anything remarkable, just congenial. We were sipping drinks for about 10 minutes, and I noticed that I was beginning to get extremely hot on the back of my neck. I asked my friend who was sitting right next to me if he'd noticed anything particular about his drink, thinking that perhaps the drink had something to do with the way I was beginning to feel. He commented no, so I tried to ignore the discomfort and get more involved in the conversation. It seemed, however, that the harder I tried to relax, the worse I felt. After 30 minutes of progressively increasing misery, I finally told my friends that I really didn't feel very well and felt that I should leave. They suggested that some fresh air might help, and I quickly agreed. By this time, rising from the table seemed to be an effort, but I managed to extricate myself from the tightly packed chairs and to make it to the front door of the restaurant. I remember that at this specific point in time, things seemed to appear to slow down. My perceptions of time seemed to be altering, going into slow motion. My mind would send a command to my right arm and to push the door open, but it seemed that the command took forever to reach my hand. Once it did, my observation was that my right hand then moved into a slow-motion arc towards the handle. The sounds and the colors of the restaurant foyer began to slow and intensify as well, much like a record player being slowed down on a turntable while the volume was being turned up. The voices around me became louder and remained unintelligible, like words being played through a tape player at half speed. I remember suddenly being intensely frightened by what was happening to me, but remained hopelessly unable to do anything about it. My last blurred memory was the door opening and my body falling through it on its own momentum. I distinctly remember fearing that I would break the glass with my fall, and then I heard a horribly loud pop and thought that it might have been my face striking something as I was falling. Expecting to feel the cobblestone smack me in the face, I found myself catching my balance and then standing right in the middle of the street. You can imagine my wonderment. I was no longer falling, but felt very light, and was standing there calmly looking at my right arm, which I was holding out in front of me. It was like waking up and then finding oneself already doing something. I suspected it would be very much like waking up suddenly while sleepwalking, becoming conscious and then realizing that you're standing in the front window of your living room watching the wind blow through the trees in the moonlight. I must also interject here that I was no longer afraid. The intense fear that I had momentarily felt while I was falling through the restaurant door was completely gone. In fact, I was so comfortable that I remember quietly chuckling to myself that my initial fear was only a stupid reaction. The first interesting thing that I noticed is that it was gently raining, but I was not getting wet. In fact, the small droplets of water were hitting my arm, and I could feel them doing so. But then they would slide through my arm and fall into the street at my feet. Yes, that's precisely what I said, slide through my arm. The excitement was overwhelming, and I felt that I should show someone else what was going on, to share the wonderment of it. I looked at my clothes, which in my perception were exactly the ones that I had been wearing, and they were not getting wet either. It was at this time, while looking down, that I noticed that I couldn't see my feet. It was also when I realized that something else was happening. A major event was going on, and I was part of it. My first intent was to run to the restaurant and to tell my friends, tell anybody. It was that thought which gently propelled me forward toward the crowd which had begun to gather at the front door of the restaurant. I noticed that I was drifting and not walking, which also added to my wonderment. When I stopped, my eyes settled on a body lying half in and half out of the gutter by the front door. The shock of what I saw sent a huge shudder through my entire being. Lying there in the street was my body, face up, with eyes and mouth open. The preceding was an excerpt from the book Mind Trek. It's a strange tale of paranormal experiences had by what most would consider to be a very normal guy. Here in the studio with me today is Joseph McMonagle. He's a retired intelligence officer, an author, and research associate with the Cognitive Sciences Lab. That's the same lab that discovered remote viewing. Do I have that correct, Joe?
That's correct.
As a result of your near-death experiences, you began to have spontaneous out-of-body and psychic experiences. You've been engaged for some time in something called scientific remote viewing. Would you tell us what that is exactly?
Well, actually, we don't refer to it as scientific remote viewing. We refer to it as anomalous cognition in our lab. Remote viewing is a specific protocol that was designed in the early 70s at Stanford Research Institute International. Mm-hmm. And what it means actually is the ability of someone to perceive a person, place, event, or thing that's remote from them and to which they have no access or they're totally blind to. For all intents and purposes, it means psychic functioning under a strict protocol or scientific control.
You call that the outbounder experiments in your book, Mind Trick.
Right. There's actually a number of different experiments. The original experiments were outbounder. That's where they would actually send someone to the target site.
So how did those experiments work exactly?
Essentially what they would do is put together a random pool of targets in the local San Francisco Bay Area. They entailed sort of standalone places that were unique within a 30-mile, 40-mile radius of the lab. They would put these locations in envelopes and then randomly number those envelopes so that they had a constant pool of anywhere from 200 to 300 possible locations. They would generate a random number prior to an experiment, and the outbounder person would pull that envelope from the safe and depart the lab. They drive around for about a half an hour and then pull off in traffic and open the envelope to find out where they were supposed to go. Mm-hmm. The remote viewer and the scientist, meanwhile, or interviewer, would then relocate to a windowless room on the third floor of the radiophysics lab at SRI. And at a precise time when we knew that outbounder would be at the target location, the remote viewer would then try to draw and talk or describe the location the outbounder was at. When the outbounder would return, then we would all go to the target location to see what was gotten right and what was gotten wrong.
And how successful were you at this?
My first 6 remote viewings back in 1978 were very successful. I was the first subject who had 5 for 6 first-place matches.
Wow. Do you kind of feel like you're looking through the eyes of the person who you would call the outbounder?
No, not actually. What's really going on, there's a misconception. A lot of people think that it's probably telepathy that's operating because of the outbounder. But in reality, the information is probably coming in through clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, presentiment. That means what you're about to see, you see, that sort of thing, and telepathy. The combination of all these inputs produces information about the target. We don't know where exactly the information comes from, but it probably comes from the target, past, present, future. It also comes from the outbounder. The perceptions of the remote viewer are very complex. Usually the information on the target is actually delivered very, very rapidly in a matter of just a few seconds. It's then very fragmented, and the remote viewer has to take those fragments and sort of piece them together in some logical format that makes sense.
And is that part of the scientific process?
Well, the scientific process of remote viewing, the protocol, there's a lot of requirements involved with it. One is that the remote viewer and whoever the interviewer is in the room with the remote viewer have to be totally blind to the target. Mm-hmm. Meaning they can't have any possibility of knowing what the target is. The target itself, the person who selects the targets or controls the target pool, cannot participate in any of the other parts of the experiment. Well, when the information is produced, the person who evaluates or judges the material against the actual target is not allowed to be a participant in any other portion of the experiment. This holds true for both research as well as training type targets. Applications targets may be somewhat different in that the only requirement there, aside from following the protocol that I've just specified, is you need to ensure that there is a randomicity in the target.
And what's an applications target, for instance?
Well, for instance, if within Stargate, the program that I was in the military, the applications target could be anything from targeting a prototype armored vehicle for a NATO country to targeting an envelope that's being passed off at a consulate party. So the range of possibilities was great enough that there was no reason to usually design a pool to hide the target in, so that there would be, no preconceived notion of what the target is.
And all of this is in an attempt to make sure that the information is totally clean.
Right. The idea, there's really two reasons why you want that to happen. Primarily, it's to guarantee that the information's psychic. What a lot of people don't understand is, for instance, if the monitor knows something about the target and they're sitting in the room with a remote viewer, they are speaking, even though they may not speak verbally. They're speaking certainly through nonverbal signals, how the person shifts in a chair or scratches their head or pulls their earlobe. All those things say something about the correctness or the wrongness of the information. So if the monitor isn't blind, then you may be delivering information to the remote viewer in other ways other than psychic. Mm-hmm. The second most important reason, and it's one that's usually missed by people, is the remote viewer has to know that they have this capacity to be psychic. In other words, they have to get from the I believe I'm psychic to the I know I am. And the only way to do that is to remove all doubt unequivocally from the process, so that when the remote viewer turns out to be right, they're absolutely sure that it was information they got psychically and not through some other means.
That's fascinating. You mentioned Stargate, and I want to talk a little bit more about that. You've gone public with all of this work that you did for the military as a quote-unquote psychic spy. I recently saw you on Ted Koppel's Nightline along with Dr. Edwin C. May, who ran the remote viewing. He was the research head for the remote viewing program. The military got involved in psychic phenomenon. How did all that get started?
Well, it actually started as a result of some earlier things that were done at SRI International. There was some work done in the early 70s, 1972 time frame, with a man by the name of Ingo Swann and another psychic by the name of Pat Price. This was work done under the auspices of the CIA. As a result of some of the targeting that they did, they were very impressed by the fact that so much information could be produced on areas deep within the then Soviet Union or on classified facilities that we in fact control. This impressed a number of people within the DoD, and so in the mid to late 70s, they decided that the Army decided that maybe this is something that they should look at from an intelligence standpoint. So a program was initiated to locate 4 or 5 psychic people within the Army. And
you being one of them, of course.
Exactly. And expose them to remote viewing and see if an applications could be developed for collecting intelligence.
It's so phenomenal. How exactly did you go about choosing targets within, say, the Soviet Union? Was it that using the same protocol as described before? Were they still testing at that point in time, or were they into the applications point?
Initially, in 1978, when we first started, we were doing training. So we had target pools set up to do training, where we had actually hundreds of targets in a pool that we would randomly select from in the local area, and we were targeting things like McDonald's, gas stations, drug stores, seeing what we could do in terms of information production. We started doing proof and principle targets with some Army specific targets, but what happened in the middle of our training is we had the Iranian hostage scenario developing, and they had, of course, no means of obtaining information on the inside of the compound. So they decided that maybe we ought to try this remote viewing thing. It turned out to work better than they expected. As a result, we were deluged with requests on targeting for many of the government intelligence services, specifically for targets that were their hardest targets, or the targets for which they had dead ends they couldn't get answers to.
And this is the CIA mostly?
The CIA probably comprised about 5% of the actual targets. We, at the time, started out in support of the Army, and that soon became, that spread through all the DoD elements. We were providing them support to the Air Force, the Navy, some of the Pentagon special units. We then spread to the National Security Council, of course the CIA, the FBI, Secret Service. At one point we were doing targeting for the U.S. Coast Guard. Just about every agency in America that had an intelligence unit that was briefed about us wound up giving us targeting, to which we were responding. So our response was across the board, all kinds of very interesting targets.
With a fair degree of success, I imagine, because it went on for quite some time through several administrations, right?
Well, what a lot of people don't know is that, they say that this wasn't a lot of people say this wasn't effective, that there was minimal information produced. Well, what people have to understand is that the operations of this project was under the auspices of 2 or 3 oversight committees. One was of course, the Intelligence Oversight Committee, which evaluated the intelligence coming out of the project. We had a Human Use Oversight Committee, which determined whether or not we were staying within the appropriate realm of using people and how we use people. And then we had a Scientific Oversight Committee, which evaluated the protocols and methodologies we were using. And based on the approval of all 3 of those committees on a year-to-year basis and the results that we were producing, the approval for the project was either continue or shut it down.
This was an annual thing they'd go through?
Absolutely. Sometimes in fact, while the approval was on a year-to-year basis based on results, and of course following the rules, all of these committee members had full walk-in privileges at any time, into which many of them availed themselves. They could walk in at any time and look over what was being done and how it was being done and review the results. And I would add that many of these agencies were supported over the entire 19-year period, so it wasn't like they weren't getting anything out of the project.
20 years.
20 years nearly, yes.
I would say that they got something. I mean, how much money was spent on this?
Well, there's a lot of estimates. They range anywhere from $16 to $20 million. I think probably...
over the course of the 20-year period?
Over the course of about 17 or 18 years.
That's a pittance by comparison.
Well, you pay that for 2 ground-to-air missiles.
Sure.
The point when people seem to become outraged over the expenditure, the single issue that they have to remember is what we got for that amount of money. And I can think of...
I want you to hold that thought. We're going to go to commercial. I want to talk about all the results that you got and some of the more specific ones. We'll be back with Joe McMonagle in just a short while.
Peace of mind. For some, an elusive goal in today's hectic environment. For some, a way of life. Hemi-Sync, a patented audio guidance technology developed by the Monroe Institute, has been facilitating peace of mind for thousands of people worldwide for over 30 years. This unique combination of carefully sequenced sound patterns promotes the optimum brainwave responses for relaxation. Hemi-Sync has been proven safe and effective in clinical applications where a relaxing environment is necessary. Isn't it time you have your own peace of mind? For more information about the many fine Hemi-Sync products, access our website at monroeinstitute.org or call 1-800-541-2488.
Stargate, a top-secret government project created to study remote viewing, the ability to describe unknown objects, people, places, and things through psychic ability. For over 20 years, psychic spy Joseph McMoneagle worked to develop and use his remote viewing skills for national security purposes. In his classic book Mind Trek, he describes how remote viewing developed and tells how it really works. Now, in the new revised edition, he includes an entire chapter on the previously top-secret Stargate program. This is Frank DeMarco, chairman of Hampton Roads Publishing Company. Buy Mind Trek from your local bookstore or directly from us at 1-800-766-8009 and ask for our free catalog. Visit our website, www.hrpub.com. Hampton Roads Publishing Company, books for the evolving human spirit.
And we're back with Joseph McMoneagle, author of Mind Trek. Joe, you were talking a little bit about what you were doing in the military, specifically over the course of 18 years, and we mentioned the fact that the Pentagon had obviously allowed for several $1 million to be spent on this program. What exactly did they have you target? You mentioned the Iranian hostage situation at once upon a time. What other sort of things can you talk about that you did with the military?
Actually, I would say probably 99% of the program is still highly classified.
Oh, really?
So there's very little that I can talk about operationally. Some of the things that have become public as a result of some of the interviews and things on television and whatnot, I can talk about generally. The Iran hostage scenario is an example. I also did a very interesting target in the extreme north of the then Soviet Union. We were asked to develop a report that talked about what was going on inside a large building there. At the time, it was the largest building under a single roof probably in the world, and all they could get was an aerial photograph of the roof. And they had no idea what was going on inside the building. They could guess based on materials that were probably being moved in and out of the building. And the best guess throughout the intelligence, through all the intelligence departments that were working on the problem, was that the Soviets were probably building a new assault ship of some kind that would carry helicopters. When we targeted the building, we produced a report that implied that they were probably going to launch a new type submarine, which would be the largest submarine in the world, and then it would probably have cruise missile capability and ICBM capability, that sort of thing. We developed a lot of detail on its drive unit and how it was being welded and constructed and that sort of thing. No one, of course, believed us because they had already bought into the assault ship idea. Plus, there was a problem in that the building was about a half a mile from the water, and if they were building a sub, no one could believe that they would be moving it that half mile. In fact, they came
out in the open, you mean?
Right, yeah. And they came back and said that we were probably wrong, so we gave them a projected launch date for the sub, which we said would be 112 days later. And in fact, 110 days later, the bulldozers showed up and started cutting the new trench to the sea, and they did in fact capture the sub being launched, and it was the new Typhoon-class submarine, which is the largest submarine in the world.
That's a phenomenal success.
Well, when it comes to the funding, and people complain about $20 million over 17 or 18 years. Just in that single example, we probably saved $1.5 million in having to chase, well, probably even more than that, having to chase this submarine all over the face of the earth in the hopes of getting a picture of it later, had we not been on site to record the actual launch.
If I was to assign you a project, you mentioned using map coordinates to locate a target. What part do map coordinates play in that whole thing?
Actually, map coordinates were only used for a short period. The whole reason they went to map coordinates had to do with the fact that it was very expensive to keep running the outbounder targeting. Having to put somebody on a plane and fly them to a place
obviously
that you were interested
in the Soviet Union.
Right, exactly. So they developed this method of using sets of geographic coordinates to identify the specific target. There was a lot of complaints initially about it by the skeptics because they said, well, if you're giving the person the actual coordinate, they could have memorize the important coordinates across the face of the Earth and would know what was at that location, which is kind of a ridiculous idea.
I'm trying to imagine putting myself in that place. Yeah, I can remember every coordinate in the world.
Well, and actually, if you were to use the city of St. Louis as an example, a set of geographic coordinates accurate to the second describes an area that's about 1,000 by 1,000 meters on the ground, and within that 1,000 meter square area, you probably would have 14 or 15 significant targets. So it really doesn't say much about the target. It's just a method for getting the person to focus. The coordinate system in any event was altered somewhat to satisfy the skeptics. We just started putting the coordinates inside seal envelopes so that no one could see them.
So what are you accessing then? If it's not map coordinates, it's not the eyes of the outbounder, where do you think? How do you think this information is coming to you?
There's within the research side of the house, where I have now nearly 14 years of experience. All of our research tends to imply that in all probability, what gets the psychic or the remote viewer to the target and gets them the access to the target is the intention that everyone has for targeting something. For instance, if the intent is to target this studio, then all it requires is an agreement between the people that are performing the act of remote viewing to garner information on what the intended target is. So the clearer the intent between all participants in a collection or experiment, probably the better the more clarity there will be in terms of the information that's gathered.
Even if only one person in the room understands what the target is specifically, so long as there's a joining in between the people involved and there's an intent to target something.
Yeah, whoever's controlling the actual intent of what the target should be. For instance, in the case of intelligence targeting, for instance, since that's in applications, there tends to be a much clearer intent. The whole reason for targeting the building in which the submarine was being constructed was everyone wanted to know what was going on in there. Yeah. That's a pretty clear intent, but simply by default. It becomes a little more touchy when you start dealing with like research targets or pool type targets, because then the intent becomes, tell me something that's right about the target. That's a lot more general. So having an understanding of that and the fact that it does have such an impact, the idea would be that before an experiment or before a pool type experiment is run, then you would want to get all the players, say, in one room and say, the intent today is to be correct, to describe the target in as much detail as possible, that sort of thing.
And what about your process and what you go through in order to be a successful remote viewer? You have these folks who are joining with you in intent. You have either a target that you know you're going towards or something that's open-ended. What happens with you when you move into this state that that some would call a zone or a cool down period, as you called it in your book?
Primarily, my job is this is how I view my job, is to become meditatively centered. In other words, empty my mind of anything and everything else that's going on. Once I've done that, I perceive my job as having to open to the target, to allow whatever information I'm going to receive to come into my head. And then I pretty much just let it float around in there as I try to what I call down analyze the pieces, or try to construct some reality out of the fragments of the input. The idea here is that there's sort of a fence line that you walk, that it's sort of a dividing line between doing too much analysis and not doing enough analysis. Too much analysis has a tendency to force people to make leaps of logic that in all probability are going to be wrong, where too little analysis means the person, the remote viewer, is never going to get out of the major gestalt arena or be able to make sense out of the information that they're receiving.
And you mentioned before that this was it involved all of your senses. It could be clairaudient, as you called it before. It had a tactile feeling as well.
It can be clairsentience, deal with feelings, or deal with touch. It can be clairaudient. It has something to do with sound or hearing things. It can be presentiment. This means that you're getting information about what you will eventually see in the bottom line. It can be telepathic, in that anyone that's familiar with the target may be sending you information. It's all of these things, and then even more. In the processing, we know that eidetic memory probably has something to do with it. That's unconscious recall of everything that you've ever filed away in your head. A lot of people have extremely big vocabularies from an eidetic memory standpoint. They've traveled a lot. They've been exposed to a lot. They're voracious readers. They have near photographic minds. They collect huge amounts of data, and it just sort of floats around up there until something matches it, that sort of thing. And there's a lot of other things going on as well. Things dealing with just survival, as an example. People that have been faced with survival issues are usually more psychic than people that haven't been.
Why is that, do you think?
All of the research tends to point to the fact that the psychic talent of an individual, and we know that every human being has got some degree of psychic talent, everyone. But the degree of talent is usually based on how much it's been used since birth. And in the processes of living life, the people who have a tendency to use it more than not are the ones that have had to rely on it. And survival is a pretty good reason to rely on it.
So you think this talent is teachable? It's inherent, and perhaps remote viewing is teachable.
Oh, absolutely. The teaching is simply teaching the technology and exposing someone to the technology. The false misgiving here is the idea or concept that you can make someone an expert or teach them talent. It's very much like music or athletics. You have whatever talent you walk in the door with. The teaching then polishes that talent to the degree to which you can do it. Because somebody jogs on Sunday doesn't mean you're going to teach them to become an Olympic, gold medal winner. Or because someone plays the violin doesn't mean they're going to play in a concert, no matter how much they're taught. So it's pretty much the same thing.
All right, and I want to talk more about that when we come back from these messages. We're in the studio with Joseph McMonagle, author of Mind Track. We'll be back in just a few short ones.
The science of the mind, consciousness. Throughout human history, mankind has asked the basic questions of our existence. Who are we and where are we going? The Monroe Institute offers a unique series of programs designed to help you explore your fullest potentials and unlock the secrets of conscious awareness. Utilizing its patented Hemi-Sync technology, these week-long programs present you the opportunity to explore your own inner world and beyond. For information on the Monroe Institute, its products and services, access our website, monroeinstitute.org, or call 1-800-541-2488.
Donald Walsh,
Mary Summerain,
Ken Eaglefeather,
George McMullen,
Charles Tart,
Michael Grosso,
Joe McMichael,
Marilyn Townsend.
authors on the cutting edge.
Hampton Roads Publishing Company.
Books for the Evolving Human Spirit.
Visit us at our website, www.hrpub.com, or call 1-800-766-8009 for a free catalog. www.hrpub.com, 1-800-766-8009.
Hampton Roads Publishing Company.
And we're back with Joseph McMonagle, author of Mind Trek. Joe, in your book Mind Trek, you talk about some of the more successful experiments that you've had, and you outline a lot of ways in which people who might be interested in learning a little bit more about this might do experiments of their own. This is something that you feel is teachable and learnable, even though somebody hasn't had a near-death experience.
One of the things that there's a lot of misinformation floating around about training. Make no mistake, you can train people in remote viewing. What you're essentially doing is you're training the technology, or you may in fact be developing methods whereby you're teaching someone how to pay attention to what's going on inside their head, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Training has nothing whatsoever to do with the protocol of remote viewing, however. Training also requires a certain degree of talent. In other words, we know from a research standpoint that every human being ever tested in the lab, that means just exposed to remote viewing, has displayed some capacity.
Right.
So everybody has some level of talent. Whatever the degree of talent is that the individual has that they bring into the training is essentially what gets polished. The training is not going to improve that talent unless the person is willing to invest the time and energy to totally recondition or to condition their sort of automatic response to what's going on.
Right.
This will take minimum 2 to 3 years of nearly daily hammering away at it. Practice.
This is what you call in your book a temporary suspension of disbelief, and I suppose you're moving forward.
Yeah, and it's a journey, mm-hmm. and most people are not willing to undertake that journey.
Would you recommend that somebody actually go and take one of the courses that are available from various people?
I think the thing that I would recommend is that they purchase a copy of Mind Trek.
I agree with you. Absolutely.
And read that first. Secondly, if they were going to take training from someone, I would search out someone who acknowledges the fact that they're teaching primarily the technology, and that the talent portion or the expertise portion is something that the person has to develop over a long period of time.
And you do not train? No,
I do not train. One of the reasons I don't train, and this is a very important reason, is one of the requirements for teaching someone that they can be psychic is the systematic destruction of current belief and the replacement of that personal belief with new realities. Mm-hmm. Essentially, you're asking the person being trained to turn over control of their constructs of reality. And I don't want that responsibility.
Right.
And I think people should think very seriously before turning that over to anyone else. It can be extremely damaging or destabilizing to the average individual.
Well, how did that affect your belief constructs?
Well, certainly the near-death experience had a major impact on me personally, in that a lot of the constructs that I was carrying around with regard to reality were irrevocably shattered as a result of the experience, the classic near-death experience.
In that you now understood that you do survive physical death.
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt in my mind that we continue on as conscious entities following the physical death. Knowing that creates a really a freedom that I now can see that I didn't have prior to the near-death experience. Prior to the event, I was probably making a lot of my decisions, personal decisions in life, based on fears. Fear, certainly not all the time fear of death, but fear of how it might affect me later on. Now I have a complete understanding that in reality, I probably carry far more responsibility than I thought I did, and so I probably won't make decisions based on how other people are going to feel about it. I'm going to make decisions based on what my perceived responsibility might be. This has a certain freeing up aspect to it. At the same time, it means that I have to be more aware or pay more attention to what it is I am doing on a smaller scale, because I'm having more of an effect. I understand the effect I'm having in the grander sense of things.
Well, one of the things that have changed for you tremendously is your concepts of time. In your book, you talk about a very interesting experience you've had somehow breaching the concepts of linear time. The nuclear test site experiment comes to mind. Tell me about that and how that affected your concepts of what time is.
Well, one of the interesting things about researchers is originally all the research was done on real-time targets. Unfortunately, for them, not so unfortunate for everybody concerned, but unfortunately at the time, what was occurring is some of the information we were getting was apparent to past tense in relationship to the targets. So someone said one day, geez, it would be really interesting if we started targeting things in the past.
Right.
Which we started doing, and that worked just as well as the present-day targeting or the real-time targeting. The actual nuclear targets were interesting in that the nuclear tests were done in the late 40s, early 50s, so they made great targets. They're also extremely high in entropy. The energy change state at the target seems to have something to do with the degree or amount of information that's passed to the remote viewer.
Do you mean like you're more attracted to
no,
high energy targets?
No, the high energy targets are the high change in state of the target seems to generate more information that's more clearly perceived. We're still working on some of the reasons why that might be occurring, but so nuclear type targets, since they have such high entropy, seem to be the appropriate first targets that you would look at from a past standpoint. Secondly, there was a perception at one time that nuclear detonations probably rip the fabric of time-space, and so there was some question as to what would happen when remote viewing a rip in the fabric of time-space.
What did that do to you? I mean, now life after death is a known. Your psychic abilities are now a known, and the fabric of time-space, in terms of the way we think of it in reality, or in linear reality, is just shattered. I mean, we were talking before about how a remote viewer is somebody who wants to get involved in this. They need to be aware of these dramatic changes in their belief constructs. How did that affect you?
Oh, exactly. And one of the things in reference to the future kind of target, one of the things that occurred is you suddenly realize that you can go 4 or 5 years or 50 or 100 years into the future and actually collect information on something that doesn't yet exist. If you bring that information back, you're then violating time by publishing it But as a result of publishing it, you may in fact be the reason for the facts existing at that particular time period that you're targeting. So
it's kind of like the show Quantum Leap there.
Well, it's a chicken or egg thing. Which came first, the conceptualization or the reality? And in a sense, I think that is also an answer. I think we're doing that in an unconscious way to start with. We're constantly shifting our conceptualizations forward in time, and that's producing new technology or inventions, which is changing our world. The problem, what remote viewing points out, is that maybe it's time to take control of that instead of doing it in a haphazard, unconscious way. Let's start doing it in a focused or conscious way. In other words, let's start changing our future by deliberately targeting it.
So now you're looking at if you're to move the scales between free will, which you're proposing we've got with regards to conceptualizing the future and moving it, where does destiny fit into all that?
Well, it is. It's the perfect application of free will. It's a God-given right, free will, and I would agree with that being absolutely true. And it's the most positive expression of that I can think of would be to target the future and try to do what we need to do that will most benefit us in a conscious and deliberate way. In other words, with responsibility and with focus. The fact that we've been uncommonly blind to that ability means that we've just simply not been exercising our free will up until this point. Maybe it's time to realize that we do have it and it's okay to use.
And destiny?
In terms of destiny, what that means to me is that the way things are functioning right now aren't the right way. We have a firm separation of science and religion, and I think they're one and the same thing. Scientists will disagree with that, and theologians will disagree with that, but in reality, you can't just decide to do something because it's technically feasible. You have to apply some morality or some integrity to what it is that you want to pursue in a technological or scientific standpoint. So if we're going to exercise the capacity of going into our future and designing it by bringing it back now and conceptualizing it, then we have to learn to apply certain theologic rules to that, or the sense of higher spirituality to that than has occurred in the past. Otherwise, we're playing with fire like little kids, and we don't know what we're going to be creating.
And I want to talk about that more right after these messages. We'll be back.
Stargate, a top-secret government project created to study remote viewing, the ability to describe unknown objects, people, places, and things through psychic ability. For over 20 years, psychic spy Joseph McMoneagle worked to develop and use his remote viewing skills for national security purposes. In his classic book, Mind Trek, he describes how remote viewing developed and tells how it really works. Now, in the new revised edition, he includes an entire chapter on the previously top-secret Stargate program. This is Frank DeMarco, Chairman of Hampton Roads Publishing Company. Buy Mind Trek from your local bookstore or directly from us at 1-800-766-8009 and ask for our free catalog. Visit our website, www.hrpub.com. Hampton Roads Publishing Company, books for the evolving human spirit.
The sound of pure enjoyment. Melodies which stretch the imagination. Meta-music as richly diverse as your moods. Creating a sense of well-being. For home or office, meta-music provides the perfect ambient background for a stress-free environment. Working in concert with the patented Hemi-Sync technology developed by the world-renowned Monroe Institute, meta-music is the perfect complement to your relaxation. For a sample of our many Metamusic titles, access our website at monroeinstitute.org or call 1-800-541-2488.
And we're back with Joe McMonagle. Let's talk about this experience has obviously changed you, all of your experiences. In your book, you continually make references to something that you call changing philosophically. Is this a prerequisite to becoming a remote viewer or an eventual outcome of those experiences?
It's actually an eventual outcome more than anything else. But it also means that you have to be open to changes in order to grow. Remote viewing, like I said, does not just happen in a matter of 4 or 5 days or a couple of weeks.
Right.
The ability to be paranormal is a conditioning, sort of a conditioning of your internal system, if you will, and that conditioning takes place over years. I am in fact still surprised by the amount of change that takes place in me on a year-to-year basis, and I've been involved in this very heavily for a 19-year period. Some of the philosophic viewpoints that I hold I consider to be very temporary. And one of the reasons why is A, I have to be open to change, and B, that might take place in the next 5 to 10 minutes.
Right.
So I'm constantly open to possibilities. I don't want to shut the door on anything that might require change. Likewise, as a result of that, I can give you an example. My first near-death experience in 1970, when I was enveloped, in the classic sense, enveloped by the white light, I was absolutely sure that I'd met God. Subsequent to that, I've had a second near-death experience, which occurred in 1985 with a major heart attack and open heart surgery and that sort of thing. And in that experience, I was allowed to see the white light, but not be enveloped by it.
Join with it.
Right, in this particular experience. This created a huge philosophic problem for me in that the light was, I could see the light was definitive. It had edges, or it had space that it occupied. In my definition of what God is, what I call the great engineer, that's not a finite being. There can't be edges. So it created a problem for me, and I went back over all of my experience in the first case in 1970 and realized that the reason I called the white light God was simply because the feelings that I was getting were feelings that I'd never had before.
And they were?
They, all-loving, all-consuming, all-knowing, complete, total comfort,
very positive,
being at home. Yeah, the extremes of all the positive things that you could say. Since I'd never experienced that before, it obviously had to be God because of the degree in which I was experiencing it. I think that was an inappropriate assumption. In retrospect, I would say now that what the white light might be is it might be what we in fact are when we're not physical. We may in fact be light beings that are all loving, totally complete. In other words, far more complete than we are in the physical sense.
So you sense it as kind of a mirror of yourself?
Exactly. And
as you truly are? Or?
I think that it may be representative of what I call the totality of self, what we are when we're not physical. Mm-hmm. If that, in fact, is even partially true, then it creates two very heavily impacting philosophic things. One then means one of the problems then becomes when I look in the mirror and I see the physical reflection of self, and I know that that's not what I fully am capable of, then I feel like I've been shirking a lot of responsibility.
Right.
And it also speaks to the real power that I have and can exercise. And I want to be very careful how that's exercised. more so than before the experience. Secondly, it speaks to what our view of the grand engineer, the great creator or God is. It's been a very limiting view, in my opinion. I don't think that we as physical beings will probably ever know what this thing called God is, and to presume that we could, I think, is really a travesty. It also points to the fact that given those two realities, then religion, as I see it, or the spirituality of man, is probably more amply displayed in the living of it instead of the worship of it.
Which is what happened to you. I mean, you've obviously changed philosophically. You mentioned morality and integrity as being two things that play in high importance.
Exactly, and it's two things that I would consider to be positive aspects of life. I no longer look at things in reality as being good or bad or evil or that sort of thing. I look more in terms of constructive versus destructive, or in positive versus negative. Mm-hmm. And in that regard, I find that most of our conceptualizations of good and evil are probably more centered around the particular social, political place in which you live and time period in which you live. So good and evil changes based on your politics or your religion or what time period you happen to have been born in or what's going on socially. Where positive or constructive action can be taken regardless of the good and evil aspects. And so I would much prefer to look at things that way, and then given the free will choice of investing energy, I can then invest my energy totally in the positive or the constructive.
So what are you doing with your talents now?
I have a company called Intuitive Intelligence Applications, and I'm doing a lot of private work, consultancy with individuals and companies. I'm also a research associate with the Cognitive Sciences Lab, the original lab that started the whole thing at SRI. And we're doing some work for some of these overseas labs, mm-hmm. and continuing to pursue the mechanisms behind remote viewing and learning how to make it more effective.
That's great. The name of the book is Mind Trek. It's a fascinating adventure of science in the realm of the paranormal. The author is Joseph McMoneagle. And, Joe, I really want to thank you for being here with us. Your book is fascinating. Your story's fascinating. And I look forward to maybe having you back on the program again.
Sure, anytime. Thanks, Mark.
Be certain to tune in next week to the Gateway Radio program and become informed on the latest information on the fascinating field of consciousness exploration and its practical applications. The opinions and the views of the guests are presented to inform you on various phenomena in our world and are not necessarily in accordance with the views of the producers or the Monroe Institute. For more information on the Gateway Radio program, write to Gateway Radio, care of the Monroe Institute, 62 Roberts Mountain Road, Faber, Virginia, 22938. This edition of the Gateway Radio program is the exclusive property of the Monroe Institute, copyright 1997, and is broadcast by permission. Any unauthorized broadcast or duplication of this program is prohibited by law. Thank you for listening.